I'm here with Dr. Chip Benight, the Executive Director of the National Institute for Human Resilience. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Dr. Benight's recent publications. Chip, can you tell us a little bit about your first paper that you've recently published titled Predicting Change in Post-Traumatic Distress Through Change in Coping Self-Efficacy After Using the My Trauma Recovery eHealth Intervention?
Sure. Well, thank you, Megan, for the opportunity to talk about the papers. So this first paper was actually written from a data set that we, Dr. Terry Bolt, myself, and some other collaborators, we worked on this through an NSF project, funded project that was from the Smart and Connected Health mechanism. And basically what we did is we looked at the My Trauma Recovery website, which is a website that's designed to be an interactive site for trauma recovery, for people to be able to interact with the uniqueness of the internet, of the web, by having certain aspects of skills to recover from a trauma that are brought to the person, and they're able to interact with the system to try to gain those skills, such as skills around being your own best advocate, so you're not sort of beating up on yourself, managing triggers related to the trauma, gaining social support, avoiding sort of negative coping like alcohol use or substance use, anger or isolation, and then how to relax. And there's also a seeking professional help. So that website, we published a randomized clinical trial on that as a disaster version of that site back in, I think it's 2012, in anxiety, stress, and coping. This is actually now, we brought the website into the lab. So that first study we did in 2012 was actually with Hurricane Ike survivors. So it was actually in a disaster setting. In this case, we brought the website into the lab, and we've actually set up so that we can look at how people are reacting to the website over a 3-week period of time. So they go through a set of modules each week and finish up basically after 3 weeks. So in this paper, we were really interested in to see what happens with post-traumatic stress symptoms over that period of time, and then also whether changes in coping self-efficacy, the perception of the ability to respond to one's trauma and manage the recovery, whether those two variables or those two outcomes, if you will, or processes, work together or not across time over the 3-week period. And what we see actually in the results from that study is that the PTS symptoms, post-traumatic stress symptoms, actually decline significantly across the 3 weeks. So, of course, in this study, we didn't have this was not a randomized trial. So, you know, could be that just time over 3 weeks helped people and they got better. But our effect size for that was a large effect size. And so I doubt that's the case. And we've seen in other situations and other data sets now that the website does help people to get better over time like this. And the fact that it's just 3 weeks is quite interesting. So we do see some clinical utility from this study, although again, it's not a gold standard randomized trial. But we also see that increases in coping efficacy, the change of efficacy is what we're really looking at here, is correlated with the change in post-traumatic stress symptoms significantly. They share not a large correlation, you know, it's about 4% of the variance, about minus a little more than 4, almost 5% of the variance. That correlation was minus 0.26. So it's not, you know, there are other variables, I'm sure, that are impacting this change that we're seeing, but it is interesting to see that as people feel more efficacious and as their symptoms drop, that these two things are correlating across time. So that gives us some idea of maybe another mechanism by which we could help to reduce people's post-traumatic stress symptoms, especially when working with a website like this. It begs the question a little bit for future research: how can we boost somebody's efficacy perceptions while they're working through these types of online systems? And there's more of these coming out now. I think we'll see more and more technology being used for trauma recovery. So I think this was an interesting study for us to see how this works in a laboratory environment over about a 3-week period of time.
Thank you, Chip. That sounds like a very interesting and important paper. Um, so what got you personally interested in studying this?
Well, the specific area with the website, about in the early 2000s, a colleague of mine, Joe Ruzek, who was our co-collaborator on developing this website, we talked early when, back when the internet was just kind of getting going, actually, and thought, wow, this is going to be a mechanism by which we can reach a lot of people for trauma recovery in ways that we can't do with individual face-to-face type of counseling. And so Joe and I sat down and worked with some other colleagues to try to think, what could we really capture with the utility of the internet? For example, you can create interactive aspects of a website that people can put in information and get information back. And we actually, in our My Trauma Recovery site, it actually customizes pictures in there and videos to gender, ethnicity, age. And so when somebody's like an older, let's say a 70-year-old white male, all the pictures in the website change to that, to reflect that individual. So if somebody's a 20-year-old black female, same thing. And so what that does is it actually increases the applicability of the site for an individual. And we use some areas of modeling from social cognitive theory to help to have the person relate to the information that's in the website that helps build their skill levels. So, so we really got excited. I mean, we had a lot of fun at the beginning of that, trying to figure out how do we create this website in a way that's going to be meaningful to people, engaging to people. I remember sitting in a computer scientist's office early on, drawing. We had come up with this concept of a journey for trauma recovery. And we were literally drawing on the screen these little islands that people could actually go to, almost like a game, and pick up skills as they went along. And that was just the original conceptualization. And so to me, that sort of excitement of how can we take theory like social cognitive theory and apply it using novel technology, at least back then, and create something that'd be useful for a large population. So that was the original interest. And then from there, it's just been really interesting because we've learned a ton in 20 years almost about engagement in these kind of interventions and how that's difficult for people. And we have to help them to get engaged more effectively and so forth. But it's been a journey. It's been really fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I definitely think technology and moving forward is going to be a huge part of everyone's lives, just due to recent events. So
yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
That's why this study is super interesting to me. So last question about this paper that I have for you is, moving forward, what implications do you think this paper has for future research?
Well, I think it's another sort of piece of the puzzle a little bit on, can web type support interventions actually move the needle on post-traumatic stress symptoms for different types of trauma survivors. And I think, we haven't done enough work yet to say resoundingly, absolutely, this website is super effective with this. I do think it tells us more data that yes, it seems to be helpful. And we, like I said, we have some other data sets where it's showing the same trend. So that's been exciting to see. I think for the future, the next type of research that we need to do is, and we're doing this in the lab now, is really looking at how engagement works with these types of things, whether it's an app or whether it's a web system. We haven't even, there's been work out there around virtual reality, but I think we can do an augmented reality. I think we could do a lot in those areas. So I think it really begs the question around, how do we boost people's efficacy perceptions when they're engaging in different types of interventions? I think that's sort of a take-home message. And whether that's specific to an app or to a website, or even maybe some of our other more classic one-on-one or face-to-face interventions, I think efficacy perceptions, boosting up people's sense of capability can be very important. And we've got to think of novel ways to do that, I think.
Okay, well, thank you, Chip, for talking about that paper. So we're just going to move on to a second paper that you've recently published titled Nonlinear Dynamic Shifts in Distress After Wildfires, Further Tests of the Self-Regulation Shift Theory. So can you just tell us a little bit about that paper?
Sure. So this paper we just published, so we're very excited about that. The first paper we published in, let me look at that real quick.
Was it 2018?
It was in 2018, and medical internet intervention research, Journal of Medical Internet Intervention Research, I think. JMIR,
yes.
Sorry. I only think of it as JMIR. So the second paper is actually published in Frontiers in Psychology, and it's in the Psychopathology division of Frontiers. And this is a very different paper compared to the one we just discussed. It really builds off of a new theoretical model that we introduced back in 2017 in a paper that was published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress. And I've been doing this work with a couple of different colleagues, primarily Kotaro Soji, who was a postdoctoral fellow working with me. He's also on this paper along with Erica Felix and Aaron Harwell. And I should say a whole team was on the previous paper too. It wasn't for sure just me by any means. So this paper is really focused on the testing of this theoretical model, which is called the self-regulation shift theory. And the idea behind this model is that trauma adaptation, we really, with our typical approaches that we've used for understanding trauma recovery, have been built off of what we call the linear model, which is really looking at sort of snapshots, if you will, sometimes just one snapshot, sometimes maybe 3, sometimes 4 if we're really lucky. But these are very sort of snapshots in time that are very discontinuous, if you will. And so what that does is it leaves a big gap for us in terms of understanding the more dynamic process that we know is happening for people. I mean, you know, clinically as a clinician, when you talk to people about trauma recovery, like even then, just week to week, you know that tons of stuff typically happens in a week, if not just a day, right? And so we really know when we write about this, we'll write about the recovery process for trauma survivors being that kind of adaptational process where somebody's having to assimilate into their minds, into their experience, what happened and make sense of it and accommodate what does that mean in their lives now. And, you know, Bessel van der Kolk's written very nicely about that, and others, you know, Ari Shalev has got a model that shows this processing across time. But really, and also the work by Horowitz also talks about that in a nice way. But from a research standpoint, we really haven't dug in that much to understand what's going on in these dynamical processes across time. So the theory actually speaks to that and takes the idea of social cognitive theory and adds the self-regulation component of that into the traumatic stress response, which is really thinking about when you think about the person as a system, as a organic system that is responding to environmental conditions, trauma really is a sort of attack on the system, right? So the system is really having to now recoil and try to get back in some way to some stability and some sense of normality. And so we know that clinically, and I think we understand that, but what really is happening for the person, because we do know that people self-regulate and we self-evaluate as a way to do that. So that's where our self-efficacy judgments come from, as we view how we're doing relative to the demands of our environment and what our goals are and so forth. So if we're in a trauma recovery situation, we're judging a lot over time, and maybe, you know, we don't know how often those judgments are coming up, but typically quite often, I believe that people are judging, how am I doing? I mean, I'm sitting here in my house, I'm crying, I'm struggling, I'm not being able to go outside, or, you know, if somebody's flooded with a lot of post-traumatic stress symptoms, they're going to be self-evaluating how they're managing that and how they're recovering. You know, I just want to be back to normal and so forth. So these self-evaluations are pretty critical, I think. And in the theory, I suggest that there's, for a subgroup of trauma survivors, they hit a critical threshold. And that critical threshold is important, because if you believe at a certain point that you can't get from where you are now to where you want to be in terms of recovery, like, and that's kind of a sense of normalcy. And so you're trying, you know, you're really pushed to try to be better, but you're not getting there. I think comes a tipping point for people, at least that's what I've speculated in the theory, where you hit this critical threshold, and that catapults you, if you will, into a different state of functioning, which I would call the impaired self, where the person begins to be, I am trauma, I am my trauma, and everything's revolving around it. I can't change that. I'm never going to be able to change that. And I call that the self-determination violation effect, that threshold where you feel like I can't self-determine, I can't get myself to where I want to go. And that's pretty fundamental, I think, in humans. So anyway, we tested that theory in this paper. This is the third paper we published, the second set of data sets that we're really looking at. In this paper, we looked at two different wildfire data sets, one from Colorado, from the wildfires here, and then the second was from California wildfires that occurred about 5-6 years after the Colorado fires. So what's nice about that is we could test the theory and look at what's called catastrophe modeling and see if the cusp process, which is really looking at whether the symptoms actually bifurcate at a certain point, whether they shift into an upper state and a lower state, rather than being in a kind of continuous linear process. Do they actually suddenly or go into some sort of bifurcation shift? And that's what cusp catastrophe modeling tells us. And we did test in both of these two samples whether that was the case or not, and whether coping self-efficacy was a critical factor in that bifurcation, that sort of shifting into a different state, which is that threshold concept that I just mentioned. And in fact, we see in both sets of data that, in both data sets, that actually we see support for that the coping efficacy variable is serving as that critical bifurcation variable, or one of them that we tested. And it is really pushing that sort of shift into upper or lower conditions of post-traumatic stress. And so what we did find is that the lower, in both data sets, the lower your efficacy, the more likely it is that you would shift into this upper state. There's also another variable that we looked at in combination with that that's called the asymmetry controlling factor, which tells us it influences the likelihood of somebody being in the top or the bottom, not whether they do break into top or bottom, which is the bifurcation factor, but the likelihood that they'd stay at the top or stay at the bottom. And in the first data set, we see that loss from the Colorado's data, and there was significant loss here with that fire, that loss of resources associated with that fire really was the asymmetry or the contextual variable that suggested when somebody was going to stay at the top or the bottom. And then in the California, that was not loss, but in this case, it was whether the person had what we call paratraumatic dissociation, whether they dissociated during the fires, and if they did and had a much higher distress level during the event, they were more likely to then be in the top or in the top in that case, or if they have low paratraumatic dissociation at the bottom. So yeah, so those were our major findings from these studies. It's the first studies we did back in 2017 were with car accident survivors. So this was really a different kind of context. This is wildfires, and we also see support for the bifurcation process and the theory.
So what was it that got you specifically interested in this subject?
Well, so I think really it's driven based on the theory. And I was starting to think about this theoretical model back in 2014 when I actually wrote my initial work on it. And it was just coming to me that we had this gap of not understanding time, basically. We're not understanding the minuteness of time as people are progressing and trying to adapt to such a difficult thing with trauma. And so that got me really interested in understanding how people self-regulate. And then the whole field of dynamical systems theory emerged for me a lot because of Kotaro Soji sort of feeding me some papers. And together we were thinking about all these kinds of concepts. And so it's just been a very exciting process to sort of think theoretically and then trying to use new statistics that we have available to us now on how to do that and begin to test these things. So that's been pretty exciting.
It is exciting. And then lastly, what implications does this paper have for future research?
Well, it has implications for future research in that if we can begin to figure out if in fact people do go through this shifting pattern, which we've seen it now in different kinds of traumas, I think the question becomes one of, do they shift like just majorly and then stay? Or are there a subgroup of people that just stay there? Are there some people that shift up, excuse me, shift up and then come back down, then go back up? You know, what are these patterns of nonlinear shifting of states that may be occurring, and what do those shifting states tell us? We don't know. That we haven't looked at this in this way before. So, you know, it's one thing to go, somebody has a lot of symptoms of PTSD and that's bad. That's kind of how we've looked at it. And of course, it shows a lot of distress, so we know that's true. But we don't understand how these things fluidly change. So I think this tells us two things. One is that we should be looking there to see what these patterns are across time, in particular because we have statistics now available to us like orbital decomposition analyses, recurrent quantification analysis, RQA, and there's others as well. So we have these different time series quantification analyses that we can do, which is exciting. So I think that's that. And then we also have this other piece of this, which is that coping efficacy, again, appears to be, as it was in the first paper when we're thinking about trauma recovery with the website. In this case, we're seeing it real time with people using these questionnaires to assess their self-appraisals, that this seems to be an important variable in their self-regulation process, which we would predict it would be. And there's a lot of reasons to think so from, you know, decades of research and self-efficacy. But that has some implications in terms of trying to figure out how can we interrupt this negative self-determination experience, if that's what's happening for people, maybe using apps, an app that could assess aspects of the person's functioning to get to a point where it could warn them, you know, you're really struggling at this point with this process, maybe this could help you. And then we could help interrupt that process. Because right now, we just are in the dark around how people are doing all that on their own. I mean, loved ones try to help people, I think, as they see it happening. But I think it's important that we can find ways to figure out that process.
Great. Well, that's all the questions I really had for you about your papers. But thank you again for taking the time to talk to me about them. And for anyone watching, these papers will be in our December 2020 newsletter. So there'll be summaries of the papers and also links so you can view the full text articles.
Yep, these are open access articles, so
Yes.
people can read them. Thank you, Megan, for your questions, and I appreciate the time.
Of course. Thanks, Chip. Bye.
Bye-bye.